Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everybody and ask people to be seated, and we'll get ourselves started here. My name is Natalie Gardner. I lead the Kim Gardner Policy Institute. We are housed here at the Thomas S. Monson Center. So we want to welcome you to our home and very excited for this morning's proceedings. I want to just share for a moment a little bit about this facility, the Thomas S. Monson Center. This mansion serves as a central gathering place and an embassy for the University of Utah downtown. It's a place where we honor the past and we guide the future, which is very appropriate given what we're going to be learning about today. I pulled this little brochure out of my drawer this morning, Honoring the Past, Guiding the Future. This is before we were called the Kim Gardner Policy Institute. It was basically a promotional piece to just kind of talk about what we're trying to do here. But I want to read 3 quotes from university leadership here. First of all, from then Dean of the Business School, who's now our president, Taylor Randall. He said, "South Temple is the place where business, government, and community have always come together." And I think he's referencing the university at the top of South Temple and the governor's mansion right here, City Hall right here, the Capitol right there. President Pershing, who was president at the time, said, "Every great city has a trusted entity for community thought and leadership. This will be ours." So he's talking there about the Gardner Institute. And then Clark Ivory, who was chair of the Board of Trustees at the time, said, "The newly restored Wall Mansion," which is this place, "will be a tremendous asset to Utah's economic growth and development. It will be a gathering place for community leaders to not only learn about the major trends impacting our state, but to come together and solve problems." And today we are talking about the future. We're doing it in a beautiful place that will inspire our thinking. So welcome, so glad you're here. And with that, I want to introduce my friend, Doug Wilkes. Doug has a 4-decade news career, both in Northern California and here in 2012. We were lucky enough to get him in Salt Lake City. He's worked with the New York Times Media Group. He's the executive editor of the Deseret News. Please welcome Doug Wilkes.
Thank you, Natalie. We love coming to the Kim Gardner Center. We've been here many times. It's a wonderful partnership with the Deseret News and today with Deseret Magazine. We're pleased to welcome you to Deseret Elevate. This is a series of programs that we've been doing, not just here, but elsewhere. On Tuesday, we were in Idaho. We were with Governor Brad Little. We were talking about some of the issues that Idaho is facing, growth, certainly, housing up and down swings. But how do you keep Idahoans, how do you keep the youth in Idaho? How do you get them to college? How do you get them to grow? On Saturday, we were at USC in Annenberg during the great storms they had down there, talking about faith in media. Jesse Hyde, our moderator today, was in New York at Columbia University. We were expanding ourselves to try and stimulate thoughtful conversation around some of the pressing issues, both locally, nationally, and certainly internationally, which will be a focus today. Our topic is the dynamics of the current international political and business landscape. And I'd like to introduce to you Jesse Hyde, who will moderate. Jesse's a longtime journalist. He himself has been around the world observing, writing about key issues from the Amazon rainforest to Russia to elsewhere. He's a tremendous journalist. He is the editor of Deseret Magazine. And there was a point where we were talking about it, and then two weeks later, he came back with a prototype of the magazine. And it was like, "Are you sure you want to do this, Jesse?" And here he is. So please welcome Jesse Hyde, and I'll let him take the program from here. Jesse.
All right, thank you all for coming today. We are delighted to have Daniel Runde and Bonnie Glick. They are both from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which in 2019 was selected by the University of Pennsylvania as the #1 think tank in the United States. Dan has also had senior leadership roles at the World Bank. He served in the Bush administration. Bonnie served as deputy administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development and is a life member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Also, on your table, you have copies of Dan's latest book that just came out, The American Imperative: Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. And for those who aren't subscribers to our magazine, there's a QR code. And I think if you click on that, you get a free subscription. Is that right, Dan? All right, Dan Francisco. All right. So today we're talking a little bit about soft power. And this morning before we got started, Bonnie mentioned that in Washington, D.C., that's a term that gets used a lot. Out here, we know what it means, but I don't know that we use it every day. So maybe we could start with that. If you could talk about what is soft power, and then how does it relate to the lives of people who live here in Utah or in the Intermountain West?
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here. I want to thank Natalie and Doug. I want to thank Team Deseret. I also want to thank you, Jesse. This is a really beautiful space, and it's a really beautiful city. I've been to Deer Valley. I've been to Salt Lake City many times, and so any opportunity I can come to Utah, I want to come. So I know, Bonnie, I suspect you feel the same way too. So I'm so grateful to be here. The term, so I've been in Washington for 20 years, and I wrote a book called The American Imperative: Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power, because I believe, and this is to your question, Jesse, about, okay, what is this and what does this mean for all of us? I wrote this book because we are in a new age of great power competition with China and Russia. I don't know if we're going to call it a Cold War. Maybe that's a little, maybe dramatic, but we're edging our way up towards something like that. But we're in a new age. And I believe that most of our competition is not going to be a military competition, though we need to support Ukraine, and there are going to be military components to this. But most of our competition is going to be in non-military realms. So when I talk about soft power, I'm thinking about non-military forms of competition and non-military forms of our power. Some people in Washington, if you talk about soft power, it's like, but that's kind of wimpy. That's kind of like I've gotten that reaction. Well, this is really important stuff. And I've learned a lot from my colleague, Bonnie Glick, about some of the issues that we're going to talk about. But we're going to compete with China and Russia in things like vaccines. Many of you heard of Sputnik, or you've heard of Sinovac. Well, in a lot of parts of the world, that's what was on offer. And China and Russia used that as a diplomatic weapon in places like Central America and said, if you recognize me instead of Taiwan, I'll give you vaccines. Otherwise, I won't give you the vaccines. And we were telling our friends and allies, hey, I'm sorry, you're going to have to take take a number, and you need to wait 6 or 9 months before you get our good stuff, the top shelf stuff. Well, if I'm a leader and I have a choice between the not so good vaccines or worthless vaccines, I could use other words, but let's go with worthless vaccines that China or Russia are peddling, and no vaccine, I'm going with the worthless vaccine. So you're going to see this across all sorts of spheres. You see this in the infrastructure space. Many countries are now developed, much more developed than they used to be, and they want energy, they want roads, they want hydroelectric dams, they want digital, which Bonnie will talk about. And so either we're going to meet the hopes and aspirations of partner countries in the developing world, or they're going to take their business to China and Russia. So the question about soft power, in my mind, is most of this competition going to happen not in China. It's not going to happen in Russia. It's going to happen in Africa. It's going to happen in Latin America. It's going to happen in Southeast Asia. It's going to happen in Central Asia. It's going to happen in Ukraine. It's going to happen in a small country called Moldova. It's going to play out in much of kind of like the non-developed world, or kind of the developing world, or the less developed world. I think you get what I'm trying to say. What does this mean for all of you? Well, first of all, did you all spend a year in your basement? I did. I didn't like it. And you all did too, and it wasn't fun. And we lost people. I lost people. And so we can't shut ourselves off from the world. We are interdependent, whether we like it or not. And so we can't build a wall big enough to stop one of these disease vectors. We are also, we're also going to need we also need trading partners. Utah's a tech hub. You're a mining hub. You're a tourism hub. You're an agricultural hub. You're interconnected and interdependent with the world. You probably have a lot of international students at Utah's universities, including this one. Well, that's an important thing too. I want to talk about that too. So I think how we influence and how we shape the future, part of it is through international education. So what the Utah's university system does in bringing international students here, you're training the next central bank president. You're training the next prime minister. You're training the next CEO of a big company in a developing country or elsewhere. We want these leaders to have Boston or Salt Lake City on the speed dial rather than Beijing or Moscow on the speed dial. So what I'm saying is if we leave a vacuum, China and Russia will fill those vacuums. So leaving those vacuums is a choice. Leadership is a choice. And so we don't have to, so I think we need to have a strategy. We need to work with our partners and friends. It's not all government. It's about the private sector and civil society and higher education institutions. So this matters to you because we're interdependent, and there's going to be opportunities for us in this new world, and there's going to be some challenges we have to manage. I'm confident we can do this because I'd rather be us than them, but it's going to require a lot of practical problem solving and thinking. And so I'm really happy to be here because I know that people in Utah are very practical people. They're very reasonable people. They want to help solve problems. They want to bring people together. And I think we're going to need to bring people together and come up with a strategy for the future to confront these challenges.
Bonnie?
Well, Dan kind of said it all. And that's amazing that he can encapsulate so much in just a few thoughts. But at the same time, those thoughts go directly to his book title, The American Imperative. It is an imperative now in a way that none of us have seen since the time of the Cold War. Dan referred to a great power competition that we have now with China. I don't use that term. I don't call it a great power competition because a competition implies that you're playing the same game and you're playing by the same rules. And this is exactly what Dan alluded to with vaccine diplomacy. The Chinese Communist government did not play by the same rules as we when it came to the pandemic and their lockdowns, when it came to distribution of PPE. Who ever heard of PPE before, right? The distribution of PPE around the world, which they took great advantage of delivering to developing countries amidst great fanfare, while we had surgeons in the United States reusing their masks for surgical interventions in hospitals. And then with vaccines, the worthless vaccines that didn't work, Sinovac vaccines, which world leaders had to accept because if they didn't, it showed they were doing nothing for their population. That's what it looked like, at least. So better to be perceived as doing something rather than nothing. But these aren't the rules by which the United States ever plays any competitive sport. The rules by which we play are transparent so that people around the world understand that America is the most generous country in the history of the world. And when America arrives in whatever form or fashion, government, business, civil society, academia, missionaries, when America arrives, people know that the cavalry is here and we are sustained. This is something that tells a very different story. It talks about a very different game that we're playing from the game that's being played by China. The competition is uneven, but I believe that the position that the United States puts forward is the strongest in the world. Innovation began in America. the creativity that drives innovation today still remains in America. But hey, that creativity and innovation, which we used to think about as being our purview solely, it no longer is. That creativity, that innovation resides all over the world. Israel is now referred to as the startup nation, and their partners in the Abraham Accords are now referred to as the UAE as the scale-up nation. They take Israeli creativity and innovation, they scale it up, and they bring it out to the rest of the world. This is a remarkable feat, which we wouldn't have been talking about 40 years ago. So how amazing is it that these countries and countries like them are our allies, and they're our stalwart allies in the global economy and in global geopolitics. That said, there are incentives that are offered to foreign governments, our allies, on a constant basis by malign countries, by the Chinese Communist Party, to develop their infrastructure that's riddled with surveillance equipment, to develop their central bank digital currencies that can monitor every transaction of their populations. These are things that when we invent technology and innovation, we don't even think about the downsides. We think about all the great things that can come from innovation. To have a counterpart on the other side of the world that's looking for ways to manipulate that great technology is something that was a little bit of a shock to our systems, but I think now we have absorbed the hit and now look at ways that we can repair damage that's been done and create further, better, faster, along with our allies around the world.
So just to pick up on that, Dan, you helped with Senator Romney's presidential campaign. Bonnie, you did too, and you're a part of the Trump administration. Both President Trump and Senator Romney said China was a problem. As we all remember, Senator Romney and people laughed at it. Yeah. I think President Trump was regularly criticized for being too tough on China. What did we kind of get wrong? What did we not understand? And Bonnie, you said now there's kind of this awakening that China is a problem. We have to adjust our relationship. So I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe what we misunderstood and then the ways we need to kind of, as you said, Bonnie, recalibrate our relationship.
So,
Yep.
okay, so I would just say that, yeah, I was really proud to serve in the Bush 43 administration. I loved working on Senator Romney's presidential campaign in 2012. I was a part of his foreign policy team and I was very active with it. And I remember, and I'm sure you do too, Bonnie, that Senator Romney was mocked for at least a full year, that he said that Russia was a major problem. You all remember this? People laughed and snickered. He was right. He was right. People owe Senator Romney an apology. I'm not sure. I'm going to wait. I'm not going to hold my breath that we're going to see that. But people owe Senator Romney an apology. He was absolutely right. And a lot of smart people who should have known better were very disrespectful. It was wrong. He also had a very clear-eyed view of China. And when I say China, what I mean by that is the Chinese Communist Party. We need to separate the people of Russia and the people of China from the murderous regime of Vladimir Putin and the very dangerous regime of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think what I would say is that there's been I think there was a shift starting around 2015, though I think people like Senator Romney were ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve. And I would say, by the way, I think Senator Romney's probably one of the smartest people I've ever been in a room with. And if you've ever been in a room with him, you know what I'm talking about. Like, he is really like off the charts smart. Anyway, so for 40 plus years, starting in 1971, more than 40 years, 45 years, we decided to try and have a constructive relationship with China. And so there was a theory across Republican and Democratic administrations that said if we engage with them diplomatically, if we engage with them in other fields, if we engage with them commercially, that over time they will sort of kind of join the international system in ways where they'll treat people better. They'll kind of understand that human rights is an important thing and religious freedom's an important thing and freedom of speech is an important thing and freedom of assembly is an important thing and freedom of the press is an important thing. And maybe, and it's important to treat your neighbors, your country neighbors with a little bit of respect. And this thesis was called the responsible stakeholder thesis. And there was an important speech in 2005 by someone I really admire, who I think is also really spectacularly bright, named Robert Zellick, and he's the former president of the World Bank. He is a spectacularly smart man. And he gave an important speech in 2005 saying, we welcome China's rise as long as it's a responsible stakeholder in the system that was set up after World War II. What's happened is since, let's say, 2005, but really I'd say starting in 2015, there's been a hardening and a crystallization of views that perhaps likely that China does not necessarily want to participate in the current system set up after World War II. They'd like to either radically rewrite the rules or they'd like to set up their own system. They'd like to take their bat and ball and go somewhere else. They also, as they've gotten wealthier, more powerful, decided to kind of boss around and mistreat their neighbors. And in all sorts of it helps us because every time they act like a bully, it helps the United States. We don't have to do that much. People say, well, I'd like to. If you look at the case of the Philippines, you'll see that we've had a complicated and we have a complicated history with the Philippines. But just recently, the relatively new president said we want to have a new strategic relationship with the United States. Why is that? Same with the country of Vietnam. So I would just say one other thing, and then I know Bonnie will have some other thoughts about this. But I think there was also a hardening of views, I think, around 2015 because of something called the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. Now, every U.S. senator on Capitol Hill knows what it is, and they don't like it. They couldn't really exactly tell you if you can get a mortgage there or a car loan there, or if they're an ATM. But they know there's something bad about it, and there's something we don't like about it. And so what it is that they set up a competitor in the multilateral system to the Asian Development Bank and kind of something called the International Monetary Fund, which is an important institution you all have heard of, may not know exactly what it does. But the AIIB largely is sort of an infrastructure finance vehicle for Asia. We're not a part of it. And people realize that going back to what I said earlier, China can fill voids. So if we leave a void, we have to understand that, that they now have the potential. They couldn't do this 15 years ago. They couldn't do this 20 years ago. They now have the power today. They have enough power. If we leave a space, they can fill it.
I started coming to Utah in 2010, and I came every summer for 5 or 6 years, I think, because every summer I sent my kids here to study Chinese at BYU in a special program for high school students called the National Security Initiative in Languages for Youth. And people in my community in Maryland said, what in the world are you doing sending your kids to BYU? You're Jewish. And I said, first of all, it's safe. The other place I could send them would be Middlebury College in Vermont, where the state flower is a marijuana plant. And second, this is a great cultural exchange. And who better to teach young people foreign languages than the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
Amen.
And so here my kids are, the most extraordinary experiences that will stay with them, friendships that will stay with them and us for the rest of our lives. And why did I send them to study Chinese? Because you need to understand who your adversaries are. My husband and I, when we were in college, studied Russian for the exact same reason. You need to be able to understand who the bad guys are so that you can understand the game that they're playing. And my kids are, they blended in well at BYU, we'll just say. They're 6'3" and blonde. So they'll never pass for native speakers. But at the same time, they'll be smart enough and sensitive enough to understand what's coming at the United States. That said, it's also a really important element of cultural diplomacy. To be able to understand foreign countries, to be able to travel, although now maybe not so much, but to be able to understand that there is a void that America and Americans should be able to fill. A place like BYU, a state like Utah, has that capability, probably more so than any other state in the United States. There is an understanding in Utah, among Utahns, about the value of international engagement. And I don't mean it necessarily on a G to G, government to government basis, but on a P to P, people to people, B to B, business to business level. The relationships that are formed when people visit and live and immerse themselves in foreign cultures is second to none. And so I think that when we talk about, again, the American imperative, the value there is for us to be present. When I was at the U.S. Agency for International Development and I would talk to leaders from East Asia or the Pacific Islands and say, what is your primary concern and what are you doing to solve it? A lot of, particularly in the Pacific Islands, a lot of the leaders would say, our concern is, are we physically going to exist as a landmass in 10 years due to rising oceans? A very real threat, which when you're sitting in Washington, D.C., feels really, really remote. But they have data and evidence that shows that their eroding coastlines are really a threat to their existence. So what are they doing about it? Well, China is there knocking on their door and saying, we'll fix it. We'll fix it. We'll build up walls. We'll build up sand structures to protect you from the rising oceans. Here's the thing. We need to be there. And we need to be there not in Tuvalu and Fiji and Nauru and Vanuatu, places that are so far removed from our understanding. We need to be there with Australia and New Zealand, who are much closer and who have resources to be helpful and who have red, white, and blue flags
Like ours.
that have to be planted in those countries alongside an American flag and a Vanuatuan flag, alongside the Tuvaluan flag, Fijian flag, to say, hey, we are here and we are supportive of what's going on and your national concerns. If we're not there, as Dan said, there's a gap. The nature abhors a vacuum. And who filters into those vacuums? It's our adversaries.
Right. So we have about 5 more minutes, and we're going to open it up to questions. But Bonnie, I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on this idea of, as you put it, being there. And earlier you mentioned missionaries. That's one way that it happens. Before we got up here, we were talking about the Olympics. So there's another way in which people come here. But maybe you can expand on that a little bit about how that relates to this idea of soft power.
Soft power is about engagement. Basically, that's the easiest way to describe it. Soft power is development assistance. It's diplomacy. But it's not just at that governmental level. It cannot be. The Chinese Communist Party would have its citizens believe that it can control all of the levers of engagement internationally. We're a free society where people can travel. Thank God now we can travel. people can travel, people can visit, people can engage, and business can be conducted. And that's going to be the way that we bring people here to the United States. It's the way that the United States goes forth to serve and goes forth to be present around the world. And I do think that that's the easiest way to have us all be part of the conversation, because the conversation is vital.
Anything to add?
No, I think that's a real good way of describing it. I think that most of what most countries want from us, they want things like access to innovation. They admire our system of higher education. There's some challenges with our system of higher education, but net, it's one of our greatest assets in the world. And you have many fine universities here. We're at one now. They admire that. They want to be our trading partner. They would like us to show up and be a partner diplomatically. And yeah, they'd like us to be a security partner, but they'd love to do business with the United States if they could. So we do a lot, we worked a lot with Bonnie when she was in the government. One of the things I constantly heard, and I know you heard this all the time, was where are American businesses? We want more American businesses in places like Africa. We want more American businesses in places like Southeast Asia. We want more American businesses in places like Central Asia. We want more American businesses in Ukraine. I'm running a commission on Ukraine's reconstruction right now. And I've been asked by the Ukrainian government to become a senior advisor to the government of Ukraine to help work with attracting investment for the rebuilding of Ukraine. And, Ukraine, I'm guessing there's probably 10 times as many American companies in Poland as there are in Ukraine. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's going to be something like that. I was in Japan 3 weeks ago, and they told me that at the important institution called the Keidanren, which is sort of the Chamber of Commerce of Japan, that there are 300 Japanese companies in Poland and 30 Japanese companies in Ukraine. We need to figure out how to change that. So we need American business is really important. I actually think, Bonnie, you have a lot to say, and I've learned a lot from you about mining and minerals. And I just think this is a mining state. And so I think when we talk about soft power, do you want to comment on that? I'd love to also, but I suspect you're the one that got me onto this.
So Dan has this great line when he talks about business. He said, in America, we're going to have to learn to love mining because without that, we're not going to be able to power the future, right? So we hear about all of these electric vehicles and the power stations that are going up, and we hear Tesla like every other word when we're talking about business. But the problem with every single one of those EVs is that they're powered with batteries that have raw materials that come from some really tricky parts of the world. And where China has a dominant presence, like to the tune of 80% of rare earth elements that are used in the manufacture of electric vehicle batteries, 80% of those rare earth elements are processed in China. They're dug up in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo. Democratic in the forefront of that is not always true.
Aspirational.
Aspirational, yes. Where children are mining minerals, there are no controls, whatever, bad stuff. China is getting a lock on lithium that's coming out of Chile, a great ally of the United States, and they're processing, which is, of course, the upscaling of the manufacturing process. They're getting access to control of the supply chains that are going to power EVs. Well, we've got minerals here in America. We have clean technologies that can process these minerals. We're just loath to do it because we think of mining and we think, ew, it's dirty. It doesn't have to be. And if mining is going to be what powers the transition to electric, then it has to be done in the United States, and we have to get comfortable with that concept.
Yeah, and I would just say that it not just the United States, but our friends and allies, Australia, Canada, the lithium triangle, a place like Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, which they're technically partners and friends in our neighborhood, but if they don't have a better offer, they're going to go off with China. So then we also have to process all this stuff. So do we want to switch our dependence on Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran in oil with changing our dependence to mainland China and the Chinese Communist Party on the processing of metals? Like, I don't think that's an attractive option for us. So if we're going to have a carbon transition, we're going to have to do several things. We're going to have to mine a lot more. We're going to have to process a lot more metals, like a lot more, like 4 times as much metals. We're going to have to process that stuff. And we're going to have permits to do this. I suspect you all know a lot about permitting in the state of Utah. So, and then we're going to have to find a whole bunch of friends to do this with if there's going to be a carbon transition, or it's going to come really slowly, or we're going to have a carbon transition where we're in hock to the Chinese Communist Party, and that is not something none of us are going to like.
Thank you. All right, so we have mics up. There's a long list of things I didn't get to. If you're curious about TikTok, artificial intelligence, surveillance from China, I'm glad you brought up mining because
Yeah, it's relevant.
But Ukraine, Taiwan, these guys have fascinating things to say. So, and then Stan over here. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I have a question about the application of soft power by the United States on the continent of Africa. I lived 4 years in Angola, and one of the things that I noticed when I got to Angola was the president of Angola spoke Russian. He'd attended the Oil and Gas Institute in Baku, Azerbaijan. But more importantly, what I noticed was the presence of about 35,000 Chinese workers who were building out infrastructure, roads, municipal buildings in Angola after its 35-year civil war. Can you help me understand what can the United States do in its approach to Africa and its application of soft power there? And I'll say that I've noticed that South Africa and Russia will be conducting naval exercises together.
Plus
So
China.
Plus
this
China.
is a ripe topic for your comments. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Carrots and sticks. So Dan thinks I'm a little bit of a hawk. I am a little bit of a hawk. I think development is really, really important. Angola doesn't currently receive any development assistance from the United States because it's actually a wealthy country with all of its oil wealth. South Africa, on the other hand, receives about $300 million a year from the United States, mostly in the form of the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief called PEPFAR, and it's been receiving that aid now for 20 years. Yet, South Africa votes with the United States 10% of the time at the United Nations. South Africa is conducting naval exercises with our adversaries, Russia and China. This is not acceptable. So the carrot, keeping your country healthy through PEPFAR resources that treat last mile people living with HIV, thanks to President George W. Bush and his vision for saving the world, huge carrot. But perhaps it's time for the United States to draw the line and say, we never ask for anything in return for our assistance. We don't. As I said before, we are the most generous country in the history of the world. When I was in South Africa in May of 2019 for the inauguration of the current president, I met the day after the inauguration with the incoming foreign minister and national security advisor. And I said, "You're welcome." "Oh, were we supposed to thank you for something?" Yes. And we call it the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. You call it PEPFAR. We provide $300 million of assistance every year for the last 20 years. And you have never said thank you. We need you to recognize that PEPFAR is not a line item on the Ministry of Health's budget, rather a grant from the United States of America and the American taxpayer. So you're welcome. And by the way, this voting in the United Nations, 10% of the time with the United States, we're supposed to be your ally. What's going on here? You vote for some of the craziest stuff. And it's almost as if it's just to stick your finger in our eyeball. And the National Security Advisor said to me, "You're right. It is to stick a finger in your eyeball because we want you to pay attention to us." Whoa, that was really an interesting conversation. And I said, "Noted. Thank you, South Africa, for being an ally of the United States." And he said, "Thank you, United States." The next day, the new president, who really hasn't turned out to be very good, quite frankly, but the very next day, the president thanked the United States in his address to the nation. Well, sometimes we just need to say, hey, you're welcome. We're not asking for anything in return, but the American people are generous. And we need the world to see that. These military exercises are unacceptable.
It's a
and
provocation.
There should be consequences.
So I think this is a great question, and thanks for asking it. So I had the privilege of helping the Trump administration put together a new policy that Bonnie's very familiar with called Prosper Africa. And so we did a lot of the think work behind it. And in essence, Africa, if you read the New York Times, I don't read the New York Times, I read Deseret. And so I just say, if you read the New York Times, you would notice that there was a study done that said something like 95% of all stories in the New York Times over a 20-year period on Africa were heavily negative. Like and you know what, I don't need to describe what that looks like, right? Think of all the negative stories you hear about Africa. 5% were positive. Well, wouldn't that scare you if you read the New York Times and that's what you were consuming, is that the entire continent of 1 billion people in 54 sub-Saharan African countries, it's all that bad news? That must be the totality of it. It's not true, but that's part of it, as you know. So part of it is a perception thing. We need to change that. We're about 20 years behind, I think, where we need to be. We need to see Africa as a business opportunity. There are several hundred million middle-class Africans. There are 700 million cell phones. There are a billion Africans today. 20 years from today, there'll be 2 billion Africans. There'll be more Africans 20 years from today than there are citizens of India and the people and mainland China. So there'll be more African citizens than India and mainland China combined. So think about it. It's going to be very consequential. So okay, education and training, I mentioned this earlier. We need to be strategic. I always ask, when I've been to 100 countries professionally for my work, I always ask, where do you send your leaders? Where do you send your kids to go to school? And if they're saying Beijing or Moscow, we got a problem. We want them to come to Salt Lake City. I'm sure the university that's housing the Policy Institute here has many fine graduates who've gone back to Africa or Southeast Asia or Latin America and have done amazing things. And that's really important. As a totality of our training, and I believe that our higher education system and educating the leaders of the future, I want them to come here. Now, I'm okay if they go to Canada. I'd rather they come to Salt Lake City, but I'm okay if they go to Canada. I just don't want them going to Iran. I don't want them going to Cuba. I don't want them going to Russia. I don't want them going to mainland China. I would love for them to go to Taiwan. We haven't talked a lot about Taiwan here, which if you haven't been to Taiwan, what an inspiring place. Gives me great hope. So that's Africa.
Stan.
So when you talk about mining, we have a mine that you can see from outer space about 30 minutes away from here called the Bingham Copper Mine. And so we're us Utahns, we understand mining, and we're all about that. As I've traveled the world, I will drive by a hospital, and in front of it will be a sign saying something like USAID, or a school out in the middle of nowhere that says USAID. And I've always kind of wondered about this influence. And then of course, you read in the media about the competition really for the hearts and minds of the world between China and the US. And to the point of where we leave, they come. And so when President Trump ran for office and kind of introduced the notion of isolationism to us and said, all of these resources need to be for the American people. And of course, in some parts of the country, it was so appealing that they went Republican for the first time in anybody's memory because of that type of rhetoric. We're going to bring it back to the US. We're going to put America first. Those are some of the phrases that we heard. And it's very appealing, particularly to those that love limited government and really don't think government should be involved in our lives very much. But it ignores this broader principle of this global competition that we're in, and how, and I guess my question is, how does that influence play out in a way that affects us in our own lives? Because we don't see it very much. We're so busy trying to make a living and provide for our families and get a good education and get our kids ready to face the world that we don't think much about this larger picture that we're involved in. But I know it's there. I was invited to a big thing downtown with Senator Hatch, the U.S. Global
Leadership campaign,
something.
yeah.
We're giving him some big award. And there were hundreds of people in that room as they thanked him for his willingness to allow the soft power to be spread throughout the world. And so those are just little data points in my own life where I'm trying to get a grasp over how important is soft power to us in our daily lives.
Do you want to take that?
Sure. Utah stands apart, I feel like, from a lot of other states. So a lot of other states, where you are from birth till death. And Utah's population, by and large, has an opportunity to explore both the United States as well as the world. And so you have these cultural moments that I think resonate with young people in particular for the rest of their lives, and friendships that they form with people who are not from where they're from. And that cannot be underestimated in any sense. There is a feeling in America now, particularly with inflation and with, go to the grocery store and in the gas station, what are you going to choose today? It's hard to think beyond what the current situation is. But I think that people, particularly who focus on what is a strategy going forward, have as a component of that strategy, how do we make a difference? How do we make a difference economically? From a business perspective, a successful business means creation of jobs here, potentially creation of jobs in partner states, in partner countries. That undercurrent is strong. We see it, right? We see that there is this feeling of America first, but at the same time, that to my mind is we are the greatest nation. We are first in that sense, but we don't live in a vacuum. We're not bubble wrapped. The danger of being bubble wrapped is that we lose sight that there are others out there who are trying to poke holes in the bubble wrap.
So I would just say thank you for your comments. I would say that a couple of things have happened. I think that many people have understood we're much more interdependent after COVID. And I think that no one is going to be able to say, well, we can just build a wall and we're going to solve every. around the country, specifically around the issue of pandemics. Like we cannot protect, we are interdependent. Now, how we talk about it is really important. And I think a little bit to the story Bonnie was telling about South Africa. I mean, I think we have to think about these issues, not just from these are important public health issues, but they have other dimensions to them, geostrategic or diplomatic or others. So I think that there's been an understanding that we're more interdependent than, say, even 3 years ago. So I'd say that. I also think there was a temptation after maybe the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and maybe the 2008 financial crisis to say, boy, I would really like to take a time out from global leadership. But I haven't met anybody in Washington that says to me, you know, I am so done with this leadership thing. I'd like to give it to the Chinese Communist Party. I've yet to meet a single person like, oh man, let's just have mainland China with their current leadership run the world. That would be awesome. So I haven't had anybody say that to me yet. I haven't had anybody in Washington say, boy, you know, I'd like them to run the multilateral system and I'd like them to peddle their crappy vaccines. Sorry, that I don't, that's not too strong of a word here, but you know, bad vaccines. They're bad vaccines, they're fraudulent vaccines, or they're bad infrastructure, or the kind of business practices that you all know what I'm talking about, where they bribe people. Like that's like a standard operating procedure. Where in the United States, we've said we need to try and change the world's, you know, business practices to try and reduce corruption, manage corruption. So if you like, you know, and what I've said is like, if you like a world where there's like religious prosecution, no freedom of speech, where corruption is kind of the standard operating procedure, poorly made vaccines and infrastructure, cyber authoritarianism, you're going to love a world run by the Chinese Communist Party. And so I haven't had anybody tell me like, I'm ready to give up leader. I haven't had anybody in Washington say so far that point. I would also say that the Trump administration came in with, this is my view, that it came in a kind of a fairly disorganized way. Maybe that's a way to put it, right? And so I think I don't think they expected to win. And then it was kind of a messy transition process. I was part, and Bonnie, you may have been part of the Romney transition team. That was unbelievable. That was the tightest ship of all time. If Governor Romney, now Senator Romney, had won, like that, it was unbelievable. Anyway, so we didn't have that at the Trump administration. They made all sorts of crazy statements at the beginning. One was, we're going to get rid of the US Exim Bank. Well, they said, know what? After a couple of years, after about 6 months of getting the intel and understanding, like they kind of woke up and smelled the coffee and said, no, we're going to put Exim Bank on steroids. They came in and said, we're going to get rid of something called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. We need to get rid of that. Well, guess what? They went and said, oh, we can't fight something with nothing. Let's turn that around and turn that and put that on steroids. So both the Exim Bank and the something called the Development Finance Corporation, I was very involved with doing kind of the toiling in the vineyards work to try and help them with that. So they got smart pretty quickly once they got in office and said, this is a much more serious situation. One thing is go out on the campaign hustings and make kind of irresponsible statements that are kind of tempting. Another thing is to govern. Another thing is to read the intelligence and say, oh my goodness, this is a lot more serious than I thought. So I actually think, so I do think there'll continue to be that temptation in certain things. So I think I'm of the belief we need to support Ukraine, and we should make sure, hope that Ukraine wins. What we want in Ukraine, just on this issue of kind of like temptations, because you're starting to hear voices like this. And so we need people in Utah, and we need the leaders in Utah, elected leaders in Utah, and I know they're great on this, to support the Ukrainian cause, because what we want is, we want the Russians to never again invade another country. We want them to have the experience they had in Finland. So many of you know they invaded Finland in 1939. You don't ever hear the Russians say, let's do Finland again. That would be great. That was such a fun experience for us. So we want them to be like, this was such a horrible experience militarily for us. We're not gonna do Ukraine again. We're gonna take a timeout from doing Ukraine for 100 years. We're gonna just leave them alone. And then what we want is for Ukraine to be really rich as Poland at least. They're 1/4 of developed. We want them to have the ag productivity of Canada, the tech strength of Israel or Estonia, the manufacturing capacities of Germany, the defense industrial base of somebody like Sweden or Finland or Israel, so that they're never messed with ever again in the EU and in the European Union and ultimately in NATO.
And the other component to that, I'll
Wait,
do
I'm
real.
getting the cut sign.
You're getting
Uh-oh,
that.
sorry.
Okay.
Getting the hook.
Sorry. Oh, go ahead.
So quick. The other area is vaccines. And pre-COVID, there's this great organization many of you have probably heard of called Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, GAVI. I don't know what it stands for, if it even stands for anything anymore, but it's a vaccine alliance of countries and NGOs that America doesn't lead, by the way. The British and the Norwegians are the largest funders of this. But in the Trump administration, we were presented with Gavi is coming up for what's called a replenishment round of funding. We need the donors to contribute to Gavi. Pre-COVID, it was focused on childhood vaccinations that, again, have saved children all over the world from things like polio and tetanus and measles. The United States, under the Trump administration, gave the largest replenishment to Gavi ever. From the United States, $1.6 billion over 4 years.
And why do you think that was?
And that was because we had this, oh, and by the way, $0 from the People's Republic of China.
Right.
And so again, why was that, Dan? It's again because America is the most generous country in the history of the world. And this was a great organization. We didn't need to lead it. There are other visionary leaders and our allies around the world. And because this is a global good, and the United States is there to participate when we're talking about global good.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Doug.
Thank you so much for those insights. We want to take a few minutes and get your wisdom now. You have at your table a whiteboard, and we'd like you to ponder this question for 10 or 12 minutes. What are ways you believe that Utah government and Utah business or the Mountain West region can help reclaim this global leadership using soft power? We talked about metals and minerals. Is Utah a leader there? Are there other areas where Utah can lead and recapture? So please, if what we would do is discuss this for 10 minutes, hit a bullet point on your whiteboard, and then we'll go table by table quickly, and then we'll wrap this up and let you get back to saving the world as it's apparently needed. So Lou Kramer, you can put your own wisdom on that whiteboard, or you can join a table.
You join a table?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'll
Again,
join your table.
what are the
Hey,
ways
thanks so
that
much. That was
Utah,
awesome.
Utah
Thanks, Sam.
government
Thank you, Bonnie.
and Utah business can
I'll see you
reclaim
later, Jesse. Thanks a
global
lot. That's your
leadership?
contact, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks
Yeah.
a lot. That was
You bet.
great. Thanks. All right, Lou, I'll be right there. Thank you. I'm gonna have, I mean,
Okay, why don't we go ahead and sit down and we'll go through this real quickly. Thank you for engaging in this discussion. Let's go ahead and start. So we'll start at this front table here and see if we can quickly go to table by table to get some of these responses. So who would you like your spokesperson to be? Okay, please, we'll try and get some of these ideas. Go ahead.
Hey, everyone. So a few ideas from our table. We talked quite a bit about education and supporting international students here at the U and at our other USHE institutions. We also talked about how Utah can set an example of leadership by solving local problems at the state level and working collaboratively. We talked about building business relationships abroad. We talked about how not only do we want more international students to travel here, but we want this to become an exchange where Utahns who are of college age are traveling to other countries and learning there also and building those connections two ways. We talked about building cultural awareness through food and restaurants and festivals. And our last conversation was about refugees. We have quite a few refugees here in the Salt Lake region, and how those refugees have great insights to what's going on in their home countries and how they can use support and how we can support those home countries through them.
Thank you so much. Let's go to this table here.
We nominate Chris.
Thank you, Dan.
Hey, I'm used to getting paid for this. You guys going to throw a little money in here, especially since I've been retired. I didn't realize how much money I used to spend. Anyway, okay, this is we had a conversation around things that we're doing really well and how can we take advantage of this. And that is, we feel like we lead out from an education standpoint and certainly from a medicine standpoint. So we want to make more education opportunities available to and affordable, and anyway, make it more available to have future leaders come here to be educated and to be inspired. Have a serious training program here, bringing future leaders to Utah. We want to also figure out, we think that Utah is brilliant from a tech standpoint because we really took off with the Silicon Slopes. And so we want to figure out how to protect our business intelligence from nation states. That's a huge area right now of information that's being stolen. In fact, speaking of China, they're responsible for 85% of the counterfeit is done in China and then exported out. We also want to groom future Utah leaders for public service. David was talking about all the work that we do in Washington, D.C. How are we taking that and really maximizing it and developing our future leaders with our relationships that we have in our beautiful nation's capital? And I think that's it.
Thank you so much.
Who's your spokesperson here? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, lots of overlap with the first two tables as well. So I think we're on to something there. But hi Lou. So my day job invested at a seed stage into fast-growing startups, and so obviously, kind of some of the conversation we had was around continuing to invest and foster our innovation economy that's in Utah, and not only that, because we're doing that, but I think where Utah maybe is lacking at this point is marketing it on a more global stage. There's a researcher out of Stanford who has been publishing research showing that Utah has the second highest unicorns per venture-backed startup in the country behind California when you look at it from a GDP perspective. Yeah, Bonnie, surprise, right? Yes, because we're not doing a satisfactory job as a state in marketing just how great our innovation economy is. And so whether that's Silicon Slopes, that's more like standard B2B, software companies, or BioHive, that's biotech. There's just so much that's happening here. And then from a public sector perspective, continuing to invest in our higher ed system, right? So that then students globally are attracted to studying here because they want that immediate access to the innovation economy that we have.
Thank you. Let's go over here. Who's gonna, Stephen?
All right, we had a couple ideas. One was immigration reform. This was brought up in regards to mining. But if we're not seen as seriously addressing the problems of the border and with being able to bring in some of those students that we discussed earlier, being the best and the brightest, being educated in the United States, there's going to be long-term consequences. So that was one point. Another was people-to-people exchanges. So back when the Soviet Union and the United States exchanged, I think it was 50 people each. So the idea that we can continue to have those type of people-to-people, or as we would discuss at World Trade Center, Utah, subnational engagement, whether it's business or people or other institutions like churches. We had encouraging businesses and the likes of, I think in conjunction with the Poland and Ukraine discussion, how do you get that 10-to-1 ratio maybe to get, to lower? More businesses investing in Ukraine. Corruption was raised as a big issue. So how do you navigate the corruption? So thinking through what are some ways to mitigate the risk there. And then lastly was this idea that aid, there's this imprint in the minds of Americans that foreign aid to other governments could be better spent in the United States. Books for students or whatever it may be. So maybe some PR efforts around that to help educate Americans on why that's such a valuable thing for us domestically, even if it's sending dollars abroad to support others. So anyway, those are some thoughts.
Thank you. Let's go to Lou. Well, number one, read Dan's book. That was easy. Follow Utah's example. Following, and we appreciate so much being here. We need to keep track of our international grads when they go overseas. Pat Shea talked about somebody who's now the dean of 8,000 students in Beijing, but he went to University of Utah. He's a Ute, go Utes. Congressman Stewart, for example, is on the new state operations panel committee, which is a big deal. Americans think we spend so much money on foreign aid when it's very much a small part of it. As Secretary Defense Mattis, the four-star Mad Dog Mattis said one time, if we don't spend more money on foreign aid, you got to give me more bullets. So I got to do that. And we also need to continue our engagement and get the word out to our friends and loved ones in the next generation, because, as Ronald Reagan said, we're only one generation away from losing freedom. There we go. I mentioned Ronald Reagan and get choked up. So anyway, thank you for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's go to Natalie's table.
We got a good list here. First one, we have so many different outstanding educational assets here with our institutions, and so we want to double down on those. We wanted to continue to elect leaders with a vision. So Natalie here said to convince Romney to run again, and so that would be a great opportunity. We need to share our outward vision. We have so many different amazing minds and great thinkers here. We want to continue to expand that and share our Utah ideas globally. We want to consider how we can export Utah ideas in a more impactful way through different service missions, citizen diplomacy, business trade missions, and sister cities. I have an example of that. I was one of those missionaries that we were talking about earlier, and I actually served in Ukraine. And I lived in a city called Chernivtsi, and there's a plaque there that says it is sister cities with Salt Lake City. And I don't know how many people know that we are sister cities with, but that we're sister cities with Chernivtsi, Ukraine. But just there's opportunity there for growth and for those bonds.
Thank you. Thank you. 2 more tables.
All right. We have a lot of duplicates of what you said, so I'll try and touch on the ones that were different. One of the ones we talked about was the dual immersion language program. So our language programs, as we talked about, are so strong, but these youth are learning from kindergarten, second languages, so they're being exposed to culture as well. Just all of the innovation, the startups, the youth, and the energy in our state where so many new ideas are coming forward and so many great businesses are being started. The family focus and belonging. We have such community strength because we have these families and networks of people who find support and strength. And also just the notion of immigration and tourism where people come here, like even the student exchanges, where people come and see what we're doing and take their best ideas back and learn from just being here and observing what they think is working well in Utah. Did I miss anything? All right.
Wow, you all were so productive. We've got 2 bullet points over here. And they kind of echo everyone else's points, but we really focused in on education, bringing people here, and yeah, bringing more people in and making it more affordable for people to attend universities and colleges in Utah, and also expanding opportunities for Utahns and other Americans to travel abroad and really build those connections abroad. And then also allowing for more work opportunities for people coming into the state. If we have Chinese students or Ukrainian students coming in, allowing them maybe to work at Silicon Slopes. And we talked about some of the difficulties around that with visas, but maybe looking at ways to have more internships for our international students.
Thank you so much. As you can tell, going table to table, there's a great richness here in Utah and a tremendous resource. Thank you so much to each of you for attending this morning, to Daniel and Bonnie for the fantastic conversation. And I'd like to give the final word to my good friend, Natalie Gardner, for opening up this space to us. Natalie?
Just a closing thought. I'm going to share a story. And Lou, you'll remember this. Just over a year ago, I was at a holiday party, and Ambassador Huntsman was there. Of course, he'd been ambassador to China and to Russia. And at the time, President Putin had his troops on the border of Ukraine. And I think you remember this, Lou, but I turned to Ambassador Huntsman and I said, what's going to happen? Give us your prediction. You would know better than anybody. What's going to happen? And, he said, this is classic Putin. He'll go right up to the edge, but he won't do it. He will play with our minds. He will, do his thing, but he won't do it. So that tells us something, I think. Someone as knowledgeable as Ambassador Huntsman got surprised. And I share that mostly to say, I don't know, I wanted to ask our guests this, but did the world change on February 24th? Yeah. We don't go back. Yeah. Yeah.
We need to engage with the Russian people, even though there's a lot of understandable anger. Almost, I don't call it hate, but there's a lot of anger. And I think the world did change. I think Vladimir Zelensky saved the transatlantic alliance, the relationship between Europe and the United States. I think he also saved the cause of democracy. A lot of people were sort of like, well, maybe democracy, I don't know, right? We don't have it's not a perfect system, and there's a lot of things to criticize about things in our system, and maybe we've taken a couple lumps recently. But I think he spoke to people's hearts and their heads in a special way. And so I do think we're in a different place. And we need to ensure that they win. We need to make sure that Ukraine wins. We need to give them what they need militarily, but also what they need economically. And when they win, they will be a strong ally and partner the way Poland is, and even more so.
Yeah. So the last word is I'm grateful for the United States of America, and
Amen.
Let's go get this job done.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.